In just a few hours, lawyers will head back into the courtroom in Minneapolis for day 2 of the Derek Chauvin trial. Yesterday, the prosecution and defense laid out starkly different accounts of what caused the death of George Floyd. For some analysis now, let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Keir Dougall. He's a former federal prosecutor. Keir, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So I guess I'll start with what your sort of biggest takeaways were from day 1, and how crucial do you think the opening statements were for the jury in this case?
So we saw a sort of typical recitation by both sides, outlining the areas where they're going to be contention. You've already talked earlier that causation of death is going to be a big issue. I expect intent to be an issue as well. These are issues that the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I also expect that the defense is going to focus on reasonable doubt and causation. But my really key takeaway from yesterday is that I've already seen the prosecution team make an unforced error. And it concerns me. I think that the prosecution team here will need to step up its game. At a key point in the opening statement, the prosecutor delivering that statement described the tape, which is obviously a key part of the evidence here, and carefully described how long it was to make the point that Officer Chauvin did not have to make any split-second decisions. And then he made an unforced math error describing the length of the tape in seconds, and he got the math wrong. You may think, well, this is small potatoes. It isn't in a criminal case that's already extremely difficult. You have to prove to a unanimous jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty, all of the elements of the crime. The defense lawyers only need to convince one juror that there is a reasonable doubt in order to get a hung jury. And of course, if they convince the entire panel, it's an acquittal. And you have a situation now with this math error where the defense team can make arguments like they've already had problems describing accurately the evidence in the case. That's the first argument. The second argument I expect to hear is something like along the lines of, well, what else did they get wrong? And I would be surprised at closing if you didn't hear a theme calling back to this issue along the lines of the prosecutor's case does not add up.
I think that's a really interesting observation when you consider that both sides are essentially arguing, pay attention to these facts and not these facts. Pay attention to, the videotape and not to the toxicology report. No, pay attention to the toxicology report and his health condition and not the videotape. So every detail is going to count as they try to sort of convince the jurors that some details are more relevant than others and other details are misleading. I think that's really interesting. So just to kind of like go over it for people, Officer Chauvin is actually facing 3 different charges, right?
Yes.
Second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. So these arguments for the defense and the prosecution, they're focused on at least getting one of these, manslaughter having the least amount of jail time. What's the criteria needed for each of these to result in a conviction?
Sure. So each one of these charges requires that the prosecution prove that Mr. Chauvin was the cause of death, that his actions were the cause of death for every one of them. Now, the sort of variable on the 3 charges is the level of intent. And that also leads to the increasing severity of the punishment. So the second-degree murder charge requires the prosecutors to prove that Officer Chauvin intended with his actions that Mr. Floyd die. The third-degree murder charge, that first charge has a 40-year maximum sentence. The middle charge, the third-degree murder charge, effectively requires recklessness, that Officer Chauvin knew about that Mr. Floyd was at the risk of dying just ignored or didn't properly take care of that risk, and that resulted in his death. That's a 25-year maximum sentence. And the manslaughter charge is effectively a negligence charge, saying that Mr. Chauvin was negligent in how he treated Mr. Floyd. That's a 10-year sentence.
There were, I think, perhaps two witnesses that were the most memorable. There was an MMA fighter guy and also a 911 dispatcher who saw the moments before Floyd's death on surveillance video. I want to play a little bit of her sound in the courtroom.
There just something wasn't right. I don't know how to explain it. It was a gut instinct to tell me that now we can be concerned.
And what did you decide to do?
I took that instinct and I called the sergeant.
And do you recall who the sergeant was that you talked to?
It was Sergeant Pluger.
And why did you call a sergeant?
The sergeant is the police officer's supervisor.
So earlier we heard in Skylar Henry's report that she thought the video had frozen because there was no movement and she couldn't believe it. So I want to talk about the impact of what she said, how significant it was that she called the police on the police essentially, and then I want to get your take on the MMA fighter witness as well.
Right, so she is reflecting, and I think it's powerful testimony, she's reflecting what, I think everybody who's seen that tape, feels when they observe that tape. Something is wrong. An objective observer is seeing problems with the way that Mr. Floyd is being treated. So I think that's very powerful evidence that somebody inside the police department was having the same reaction that the rest of us have when we see this tape. Now the fighter, Mr. Williams, his testimony is important because if I understand his testimony, he was training at some of the same physical self-defense training that the police officers were, and so his testimony is about the way Mr. Floyd was being choked, and that that when you're using these types of techniques, you can hurt or kill someone. And his testimony as a witness on the scene, directing commentary at Officer Chauvin in the moment that this technique is dangerous, is important evidence for the prosecutors to put Mr. Chauvin on notice to help establish Chauvin's state of mind in the moment when he is on Mr. Floyd, to dispel any argument or what I expect to see arguments that he was. We've already heard them, that he was using proper techniques, that he didn't think that he was causing harm to Mr. Chauvin. That's why that testimony is so important.
Yeah. Keir, I hope we're going to have you every day of this testimony. Hopefully, we'll see. Keir, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne Marie.